Welcome back to Cognitive Processes. In Chapter 3, we're going to talk about perception, which is a very interesting area of cognitive processes that has to do with recognizing patterns and objects. I think when you first look at the topic of perception, you think it's all about the mechanics of the eye detecting information or the mechanics of the ear detecting information. But what you'll see in this chapter is that there's so many interesting things going on in your brain that leads you to see or hear things differently than actually what doesn't match reality. And that's why perception is an interesting topic. It creates our reality. And one of the things that you'll see is that what we come to a situation with in our past history or experiences or learning, that's what will change how we see things now. So, first of all, a couple of terms. So, when you look at an object in your field of view, such as a book, we will call that a distal stimulus. So, you're looking at something that's a distal stimulus like a book, or you're hearing a sound that could be a distal stimulus. Then that information out there in the real world gets translated into a stimulus that is detected by your nervous system, like a proximal stimulus, like the retinal image at the back of the eye. The retina is detecting the image of the book. That's not the full process. Then you have what actually is what we experience as the book in our brain. And that recognition of the object that we're seeing as a book is called the percept. The percept is partly a, 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 a recognition of the object out there, but it also is partly based on our prior history of knowing about what books look like, our prior recent experiences of knowing what books might be piled on our desk. And so, even if the majority of the book is blocked from our view, we still know it's a book. So, that's where the interesting part of perception comes in, is that top down knowledge. So, top down knowledge, the beginnings of understanding about our top down knowledge came from Gestalt approaches. And this was the idea that it's not just the individual stimuli coming into our system, the little bits and pieces, it's the whole that's greater than the sum of all the parts. And so this picture is just another example of how interesting this process can be. So in a figure ground relationship, if you first glance at this picture, you might see just branches and a scene of two people on vacation, probably looking out at the ocean. But if you look carefully, you can actually also see the baby in the branches. So if you look at the picture carefully and you see the outline of the baby in the branches, you're relying on the figure ground relationship. Likewise, if you look at this picture, we tend to see an outline of that open rectangle, that white rectangle in the center. That really is a contour that's illusory, that's subjective. We tend to add meaning to make our world make sense. If you think about it, a lot of what we see in the world, what we hear in the world, is incomplete information. And so our brain has to fill in the gaps. And we're actually excellent at doing that, of filling in the gaps. And so some of the early research on Gestalt psychology was looking at this idea that we how do we add in organization to what is coming in sensory information. So the Gestalt principles are things that are sort of like take home messages of organizational principles that we are using regularly. One of them is that things that are close together, there's close proximity, those things probably go together. So if you see a bunch of dots like on the left panel in panel A, if you see all these objects and they're close together, you think they belong to the same group. Likewise, similarity. If you see things that are similar in color, in texture, you think those things go together. So in the right panel, in panel B, you see blue items and brown items and yellow items and teal colored items. And so you see sort of four columns because the colors, you group the colors that are the same together. You also have good continuation. Examples C and D are like that, where, if you see lines, you feel like they continue. Um, you have closure. So looking at panel E is a great example. Even though there's a gap in the line on the right side of the figure in E, you think of that as a complete rectangle because you just close it in your mind. Even though there's a piece of it missing or a piece of it blocked from view, you would think of that as a whole object. Also, common fate. If you see objects moving in certain directions, so in F, some objects are moving to the top and some objects are moving to the bottom. You think of those objects that are moving together as having common fate. So there's this overarching law of pragnance that is, we tend to select organizations that yield the simplest and most stable shapes and forms. So whether we think about good continuation or similarity or proximity or common fate or closure, all of those are simplifying our world based on things that make sense and that lead us to a simple explanation of what's going on in the world. And if you think about how our perception is so often relying on incomplete information, then this helps us make sense of the world and decreases the amount of processing that we have to do. So how do we do that? We take these bits of pieces of information and then we build up to this perception, this percept that we are relying on. And there's different ways that we can do that. This is called bottom up because we're taking the bits of information that's out there in the real world and building it up, bottom up. And there's different ways of doing it: template matching, feature analysis, and prototype matching that we'll talk about. So template matching would be the idea that we would have this template in our brain that we match it, like the numbers, that we have a number in our brain. And so when we look at a check, we can use the numbers on the check and match it to a template in the brain. And that's how we figure out what numbers are on the check. In our outside world, it allows us to build up this percept. Well, it sounds like a great idea initially. There are some problems with these template models. Obviously, the first major problem is that we would have to store an impossibly large set of templates in our memories. Just think about the number of ways you could write a number. You can go in your computer, think about all the different fonts on your computer. If you needed to have a different template for all these different fonts so that you could read words or read numbers or things like that, then it would just take up so much capacity in your brain. Also, then, how do we recognize new objects? A lot of times we have no problem figuring that out. And so how would we do that if we didn't have a template in our head? And then how do we recognize variations on objects? Like, for example, you have a template for a certain kind of font, like maybe Times New Roman 12-point font, but then suddenly you're reading in Georgia font. And so if this sentence is written in different handwriting or handwritten, can we still read it? The template model would say, no, you couldn't because you wouldn't have a matching template in your brain. But we can do this. And so those are all challenges of the template models. So problems include we would have to store an impossibly large set of templates in our memories. And then how do we recognize new objects? And how do we recognize variations on an object? For instance, a sentence written in a different handwriting. So another way of doing this is by features. We do know from neuroscience studies that there are feature detector cells in the visual cortex. So, there are certain cells in the back of the visual cortex. If you show a cat a certain angle, there will be a cell that will fire that you can attach an electrode and show that that cell is firing in the visual cortex in response to that particular line and the orientation of the line, but not maybe a different line. So if we have all these feature detectors in our visual cortex, then that should allow us to build, more complex things. So like the letter A is developed from a set of lines, two angled lines and one horizontal line, and V similarly. And so you could use all these individual features to build. Researchers had thought, well, maybe there's also even more complex objects. So maybe not only just lines, but geons were the idea that we had, rectangular objects, cylindrical objects, a cone-shaped objects, things like that. And then we used all those features to build. But some of the challenges of this approach was there's really not a great definition of what these features are. And then does the same set of features apply to all objects? Letters are one thing, but what about faces and other things? So then the other approach would be to use prototypes. So the idea of a prototype match is that you would have new stimuli coming in, and they're matched to a prototype in your memory, an idealized, typical representation of a category. And it doesn't mean that a perfect match is required. It doesn't. You can have a match that's close enough. But unlike template matching theory would really say you'd have to have exactly the same thing, like a perfect match. Like if you have a letter and you go into your brain, and if the letter is written in a different font, you wouldn't be able to recognize it. The prototype approach would be able to accommodate like a font difference, things like that. So there's nice evidence from a variety of different studies. Cabeze et al. In 1999 had prototype faces, and participants were more likely to say that they recognized prototype faces that they'd never actually ever seen before than to recognize other less prototypical new faces. That would suggest that you have some prototypes in your brain of typical things. So you might have a prototype of a typical person of some characteristics, or a typical dog of some characteristics, or a typical, table or things like that. And then you're able to match to the typical thing. So think about this in an example. So on the right side, you have like your typical prototype dog. That is the dog that is the average of all the different dogs that you might see. And so, a really good example of a dog. And so then you would be able to recognize other dogs by matching it to that prototype in your brain of dog. So if you saw an unusual looking dog, then, it might take you a little longer to identify that dog than you would a typical dog that looks closer to your prototype. So likewise, if you had a cat, you wouldn't recognize it as a dog because it has some characteristics that are not part of your prototype. The alternative approach would be to think about interacting with specific instances or exemplars in your world, in your history. So what this model would suggest is that your idea about a dog and how you use that information to classify new dogs is based on your personal experience with dogs in your life. So say you grew up and you had a miniature Schnauzer as one of your dogs, and now you have a Cavalier King Charles Spaniel as your dog. So you have had many smaller dogs as your typical experienced dogs that you have lived with. But then you also lived in a neighborhood, and maybe you had a neighbor that had a German Shepherd dog. So that is also part of your exemplars and your history. And so those are your examples that you have learned in your brain. And so when you see a new dog, you'll be fast if you are identifying dogs that are similar to dogs that you've personally learned about, as opposed to like all the dogs in the world and just what is an average of that dog. So here's another example that's not about dogs, but same idea. So if you have someone told to identify if they are responding to a color green, if you have a prototype for green, then a really perfect true green, a good match for green, you would be very fast to respond to that. But if you have a green that's a little bit atypical in color, maybe like a super light colored green, not a great match, then that you should be slower to respond. So the idea is that you hear a green, if it's a really good example green, then you would be faster to respond than if you have a green that is a poor example for the category. So what the idea is that these are two sort of competing ideas. One idea is that we learn prototypes we have a category representation that's a perfect example of a category, sort of averaged across all the possible examples, and then you have another category that's averaged across all the examples, or you have an exemplar model, which is shown here on the left. These are fake stimuli from a study that I'll talk about in a second, the Bowman et al. Study. And the idea is that, you have some category A animals, but they might have overlapping characteristics with category B. And then category B animals that may have some overlapping characteristics for category A. And so when you have these different learned examples in the exemplar model, you learn each individual item, whereas in the prototype model, you're learning the average. So think about this study, but the Bowman study, and this is the abstract from the study. The idea is that there's a long-standing debate over whether categories are represented by individual category members, these are the exemplars, or by essential tendency abstracted from individual members. This is your prototype average. Neuroimaging studies have shown neural evidence for either exemplar representations or prototype, but not both. And then, so in this study, they asked whether it was possible for multiple types of category representations to exist within a single task. They designed a categorization experiment to promote both exemplar and prototype representations and then tracked their formation across learning. And they found only prototype correlates during the final test. However, interim tests interspersed throughout learning showed prototype and exemplar representations across distinct brain regions that align with previous studies. So in other words, what they found is that we might be doing both, and that there are certain brain regions that are contributing to the learning of one type or the other. So this slide kind of shows a lot, but what it basically shows is that during the first phase of learning, so looking at the D pie chart, you can see that during the first phase of learning, people are probably using somewhat prototypes, but then in the second phase, they get really nuanced in details and they learn a lot about the animals, each specific instance kind of getting stored, and then in the final test they're using maybe some more prototypes. So the idea is that we're probably doing a bit of both. We average across categories, we also learn specific examples, and we use both types of information. And think about it, it makes sense in terms of your own experiences of when you learn how to categorize. So if you have little kids and they've learned about a dog, they may not recognize a Chihuahua if they have a golden retriever at home, because the Chihuahua is such a tiny little thing that it doesn't match their very simplistic notion of what a dog is. They might call it a cat or a bunny or something like that. But then as the child gets older, they have all this nuanced representation of what a dog might be. Some of it is like an average across categories, but then also it's probably specific learned information about those dogs that they've actually encountered in their life. Okay, so we are obviously doing nuanced things when we take information from the outside world and then make judgments about it. Another thing that is important to pay attention to is that our information does not occur in isolation. We have context, and that context is really interesting. So in this picture, you see a bunch of black and white pictures, and you probably have no idea what these things are. Out of context, these little photographs don't probably mean anything. You might be able to get a bit of a clue, but this kind of jumbled mess of pictures is an example of why there's some problems with the bottom-up theories of attention. When you just look at specific stimulus details like lines and curves, that doesn't allow you to figure out what's going on in a scene. You've got to have some top-down information of things you've learned and build that in there. So here you have a picture of all those same pieces but put together properly, and then you're like, oh, kitchen. Yeah, all those pictures, even though it's a black and white photograph, this is your kitchen. And so this allows you to already have so much information. So the idea is that we must have our prior history, our prior learning, our prior expectations, and that is influencing the bits of information that are coming in, and how we decide what we decide about something. So in top-down processes, we'll talk a little bit about David Marr's theory and perceptual learning, and use the example of the word superiority effect. So in Marr's theory, the idea is that we probably have a primal sketch, which is the bottom-up process. This is what we've already talked about, where you use edges and bars and blobs and lines, and that information is coming in, and you're using that information to start to decide what's going on with an object or a scene. Then you have probably what is called the 2.5D sketch. That's your bottom-up processes with a little bit of local surface orientation to figure out what's happening. And then you have the top-down process, the 3D sketch, that gets incorporated. And this includes all the information about, the outside world, but also your history and what you expect. So, if you are looking at a picture of a kitchen and it's closer to what you expect as being a typical kitchen, you may be faster to recognize it. And you would be super fast if it's your kitchen or it's a picture of a kitchen that you have had experience in. Okay, so what about perceptual learning? Over time, participants are learning to recognize. And so this is stimuli from a study by Gibson, and the participants learn to recognize copies of an original stimulus through learning to pay attention to features that they had not noticed earlier. So it may seem a little bit difficult to understand what's going on here with the squiggly lines, but what you think about a real life situation, like at wine tasters. When they first start drinking wine, they're not going to be very nuanced, but as they get more and more experienced at tasting, then they'll be able to identify the type of wine, maybe even in the vineyard, the type of grape, the type of soil conditions that contribute to a particular taste as they get better and better at learning this perceptual information. Likewise, when you first see these squiggly lines, you're not going to be able to tell very much. But then over time, if you get exposed to these stimuli over and over again, you realize that some little squiggly lines, go to the left or to the right, or there's more circles or less circles, and you learn to pay attention to those details. Think about another example, the word superiority effect. So imagine you are trying to do a task where you are asked to recognize if the letter D or K is in the stimulus. And what people have found is that if you give random strings of letters, like the bottom example, R, W, O, D, or the middle example where it's just a bunch of dashed lines in D, you're not going to be as quick as if the letter D is actually in a word. If you're reading something that is actually a word, it's easier to recognize a letter in the context of a word than when presented the exact same letter alone or in a group of random letters. In other words, this negates the idea that you just have bottom-up processing where you're just looking at lines and curves and you're detecting that in the visual cortex. That can't be what's happening here, because why would you be so much faster to respond to, oh, D is in the letter word, clearly top down. All that information about reading has helped us be faster at recognizing the letter D. So connectionist models have been developed, computerized models that look at, how is this information coming in from the bottom up and top down, and how do we recognize? These are sort of the beginning stages, and we'll get to this later in the course, of artificial intelligence models. So really interesting sort of start to understanding how we're doing this. So visual input comes in. Think about it at the bottom. You have visual input coming in, these features, or acoustic input coming in, sounds. And then you build them together. The features get built into letters or phonemes or sounds, parts of word sounds. And then you start developing these words. But also you have the top-down and higher level input coming in of what is expected. And then you have feedback through all these systems. And so you have bottom-up information that's super important, but top-down information. And the more bottom-up information you have, you'll be faster. More top-down information you have, you'll be faster to recognize, what's going on in a word. And the more you have from both directions, that'll help. So That's how we do our word perception. Face perception is interesting. It's kind of this interesting sort of unique situation where we're really good at viewing faces as complete wholes. So, unlike maybe words where the features are super important, with faces, you have our tendency to view faces as complete wholes. And when you sort of chop up faces, use a software program to take faces and take out the components, we're actually really bad at identifying what's going on in faces. So, you know, in this example, we have the composite face illusion. In panel A, you have the two identical top halves are perceived as being different because they're aligned with different bottom halves. Misaligning the bottom halves in B breaks the illusion, and the powerful visual illusion indicates that our visual system automatically integrates the two halves of a face into a global contribution configuration. Okay, so in other words, there may be certain stimuli in our world where we rely more on big picture wholes and more we rely on features. And so that's okay. It makes sense that our brain is flexible enough to do that. So in some cases, the connectionist model should rely more on the bottom-up information. In other cases, the top-down information should be prioritized. Also, thinking about direct perception, Gibson did some really interesting work that put lights on people and in their joints and looked at people walking. And what research like this has shown is that when people are acting, the perceiver actually has to do very little work in interpreting. So you can see things that are very limited amount of information coming in that bottom up, and you'll be able to figure out if someone is walking, if they're jogging, whatever they're doing. You might be able to tell if they're, a younger person, an older person, all kinds of interesting things. And what it tells you is that the top-down information really can be super useful, and we don't need a whole lot of bottom-up information to make judgments. So the last little bit here is about interesting agnosias. So when we have problems with perception, and these are examples, visual agnosias are examples where there's nothing wrong with your eyes. So this is something going wrong in the brain, but not like the eyes are working fine, the retina is fine. But when there's sort of a brain, perhaps there's like been a stroke or something like that, some sort of brain damage. And so you have examples here of where someone is given a target object to copy, and then they were asked to copy and make an example. So here, there's, the person can draw, the visual information is fine, but then they really have trouble, looking at various things to make a copy of it. So there's different kinds of visual agnosias. We'll talk about three. There's apperoceptive agnosias, where they can process a very limited amount of visual information. They can see outlines, but they cannot match objects or categorize objects. So in other words, they can see an outline. If you show them a picture of a dog, they can see the outline of the dog, but they wouldn't be able to tell you that belongs in the category of dog or match another picture of a dog to the outline. An associative agnosia can match objects or drawings, but only very slowly and very carefully, and they get very distracted by small details. So, tiny little detail would be perhaps blown out of proportion, in that example. And then prosopagnosia, as you know, a specific agnosia that prevents you from seeing and recognizing faces. So we have, a specific kind of agnosia that tells you like faces are special, and then also, their particular damage to part of the brain can result in just like a specific loss of that ability. So a little bit of a review about perception here. We talked about perception. Perception is more than the sensory information coming in. In fact, a whole lot more. There's so much going on top down that your brain is doing. So your brain obviously does use bottom-up information, the information coming in, but also those top-down processes. We talked a little bit of Gestalt principles about how we organize patterns. We talked about the bottom-up models like template matching, prototype matching, featural analysis, and then the top-down models like David Marr's theory is a good example. And then we talked about the visual agnosias. When things go wrong, the neurological basis of perception gets reinforced. It tells you that when you lose a specific ability to do a certain thing in perception, that tells you that there's parts of the brain that are doing these various perceptual tasks. And it provides a really nice additional piece of information that tells you how interesting the brain is in applying this top-down information as well as the bottom-up information. And that's perception.